Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure this morning to invite Evans Lansing Smith. Also, before that, I'd like to thank you all for being flexible this morning and dealing with the change of arrangements to all Zoom. I'm sure many of you would like to be here in person, but we're in Los Angeles. We're not very good at dealing with rain. So it's nice that everybody's safe and dry. Anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Smith. I learned last night that he has been coming to talks at our institute since the 1980s when he was a graduate student at Claremont. But this is his first time actually being our guest and speaking for us. So it's an extra pleasure to have him here. Dr. Smith holds degrees from Williams, Antioch International, and Claremont, and has always been a scholar and an educator. He has served as the chair for 12 years and is now core faculty of the Mythological Studies program at Pacifica. In addition, he has led mythological study tours in France and England and is the author of 10 volumes on comparative literature and mythology, in addition to 2 books, volumes of poetry, and 2 novels. All of those that you're interested could be ordered from our bookstore. We have a wonderful mailing program at the moment. So if you call and order something or order it online, Talia will drop it in the mail and send it to you. So the fact that we're not at the Institute doesn't mean that you can't get all of the books. I think without further ado, I welcome you, Dr. Smith, and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all,
actually, sorry to interrupt. I didn't get to say just the meeting basics, which is we will go for about 1 hour and take questions at that point, and then we'll have a short break. And then if you do have a question throughout, you can put it in the chat, but I'll just wait until the question time to read it. Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Dr. Smith.
First of all, thanks to everybody for making this change to Zoom. We're having heavy rain and flooding up here in the Ojai area, and it alleviates a lot of anxiety getting out on the road in these circumstances. And I'm so grateful for your flexibility. I'm very sad that I couldn't do this in person because it's a kind of summation and walk down memory lane for me to engage in the Institute again. And I'm very grateful for this incredible team that's helped put that together. So without further ado, let's proceed with my presentation. And these are the events that I attended at the Institute back in the early 80s, where I got to hear Edinger speak about his upcoming book on alchemy, Hillman's book on the anatomy of a personified notion, the subtitle of which tells a great deal about the difference between the two men. And then finally, later on, Joseph Campbell was invited to present when his magnificent book, The Way of the Animal Powers, came out for the first time. So it's really a wonderful time for me to look back at those marvelous days at the Institute while I was in graduate school out in Claremont. And as is befitting for a Jungian audience, I want to begin with a short dream which really led to this remarkable experience. And I had this dream after deciding not to be a lawyer or an insurance salesman or a mortgage banker in Baltimore. I was very interested in the arts, the humanities, and literature. And I had suffered through a traumatic loss of my mother when I was 16, when she committed suicide. So in those days, there wasn't an analyst on every corner to help with those things. And I simply decided to leave the place of the wounding and went to Dublin for a creative writing program, during the course of which I produced a novel with a collection of poems called Communion Shades. And I'm sharing this story because it has to do directly with the notions of fate and the daimon, individuation, and so forth, which, of course, in Campbell's model of the hero journey, always involves departing from the standard path and trajectory to explore the unknown of what he called the sinister path, the counterclockwise direction. So I have a picture of myself here as a young man in the countryside of Ireland at the time when I was beginning work on the novel and a series of poems. And it was on that occasion that I had the following dream, in which I'm leaving at night, a very dark marina on the coastline of Wales, moving out on a ferry to cross the legendary Irish Sea. And when we get out into the open sea, the boat hits something and slowly starts to spin around, generating a kind of a whirlpool when we reach the open sea. And it later becomes clear that what happened is that the ferry has sliced through a large sea dragon, cutting it in half. And that has generated the whirlpool. And as the boat begins to turn, I go over to the railings of the boat and look down into the whirlpool. And from the bloody foam of drowning sailors, um, a woman, a girl, slowly emerges from the depths of the sea. She's naked, and I bring her up onto the deck after she emerges from the whirlpool. And the first thing that happens is that the crew takes her away into another cabin, and she comes back fully dressed in the costume of a young woman from Maryland that I had met that day, whom I call my Lady of the Manor. And I've amplified that poem. I wrote a poem about it and amplified the imagery over many years. And we don't have time to pursue those. And I see the image that's being projected now is unfortunately truncated, but it's a Murakami piece. I believe it's in the second floor of the Broad Museum. And it's a spectacular example of the night sea journey with the man standing at the railings looking down into the water with an abundance of whirlpools. And you will also, I apologize for the truncation of the image, you will also see the dragon emerging from the whirlpool. So it's very, very close to the imagery of this epiphany, you might say, of the archetypal feminine, with the various associations that one could make with it, such as, for example, the birth of Venus in the theogony of Hesiod, emerging from the bloody whirlpool created by the castration, Kronos, and the castration motif. And there is a bit of that in the dream as well, given that when the boat slices through the sea serpent, it's at that point exactly that the feminine emerges from the depths. And a central theme in our work together today will be this movement from the complex to the archetypal imagery, which is all kind of in this dream. And it was directly as a result of that dream, which I shared with the poetry workshop at the Divinity Hostel outside of Dublin, that I was introduced to the work of Joseph Campbell by the young woman from Maryland who had come into my dream. And she gave me A Hero with a Thousand Faces. And at that time, I believe it was the portable Jung that Campbell had edited. And she said I needed to read this section on the destructive mother archetype. And I had no idea what that was. I had never read Joseph Campbell, but she was kind of spot on and opened up really the whole trajectory of my life, my career, such as it has been, beginning with the purchase of this battered copy of Volume 4 of The Masks of God on the left, which is the subject of our time together today, a spectacular, marvelous, marvelous book that's been reissued in the collected works of Joseph Campbell. And as a result of sharing that in the context of the writing seminars, I subsequently was told by the same lovely young woman that there was going to be a trip to northern France with Joseph Campbell to study the Grail romances. And I thought that a rather more attractive alternative than returning to Baltimore. So I signed up and found myself on the bus coming into Chartres at twilight, and here sitting on a patio in a hotel overlooking the Loire Valley. And in the last 2 years, I've returned to a rereading of creative mythology. And I just can't highly recommend it enough for those of you interested in Jungian depth psychology, comparative mythology, and particularly the mythologies of the Grail romances of the Middle Ages, which occupies a central part of the book. But it's a very, very rich book with a lot to offer. So I'm being very selective in what we're doing with it by focusing on the roots of the emergence of the Jungian dynamic of the idea of individuation and the engagement with the archetypal energies of the unconscious in a process really of finding one's own unique identity. And I've taken the title of this section of the presentation from a marvelous book by a man named James Olney called The Rhizome and the Flower, the Perennial Philosophy in Yeats and Jung. I would just modify it as the Perennial Mythology in Yeats and Jung, and the notion that Jung emerged from a very rich background of European intellectual history and culture that is directly relevant to the notion of the self and the processes of individuation. And this is a kind of summary of those sections of the book which address these important precursors leading to Jung's notion of the self, moving from the Greeks to the Anglo-Saxons, then on up to Schopenhauer and Jung and Hillman with the notion of the daimon. And this little wonderful little golden seal from the excavations of Sir Arthur Evans at Minoa and Mycenae show you a row of genius figures. This notion of the daimon as an internal genius that is somehow operating over the dynamic of the unfolding of our lives. And here you can see these three rather charming, actually four genius figures bringing offerings to the central goddess of fate as an important symbol connected to the Greek world. And I need to be able to read a bit more than I'm used to in PowerPoint presentations because the language is so important in both Campbell's writing and the selected passages from Schopenhauer that we're going to take a look at. So the key point here with the emergence of the notion of fate and destiny in the Greek world is the emergence of some dynamic of a secret, deep continuity in things that is not immediately evident on what he calls the empirical surface of our experience. And hence he provides a variety of forms in the Greek for these notions of fate or destiny. Patmos, that which befalls one, the divine dispensation of one's lot, and what is allotted or foredoomed, and then the notion of moira, one's portion of destiny, as a dynamic central to the emergence of Greek culture during the Golden Age. And this quotation at the bottom, that our deeds are inevitably the product of two factors. One, our intelligible character, which stands unchangeably established, yet becomes known to us only gradually, a posteriori. And two, our motivations, which come to us from without and are supplied from the tides of world events. And this is a quotation from Schopenhauer, towards whom we are moving. And the illustration on the right there is this wonderful painter, pre-Raphaelite painter, Edward Burne-Jones. And it shows the Perseus with the gray ladies retrieving the eye that he needs to confront the Medusa. And these are the three dynamics of the fates in the context of the Greek world. Right alongside that, in the unfolding of the intellectual foundations of Campbell's book, is the notion of weird in the Anglo-Saxon world, associated with Beowulf. You'll see artifacts from the famous Sutton Hoo discovery on the left here, and the connection that Campbell makes with the notion of weird, recaptured in Shakespeare's Weird Sisters, and suggesting that they're transformations of the witches of the Norns of the old Germanic mythologies, who are described in an Icelandic poem called the Völuspá, the wise woman. And these are three Norns in the iconography of the Nordic world, who are depicted dwelling by a well at the base of the world tree of Yggdrasil, watering the roots of the tree. And then there's this further exploration of this notion of the Norns in Old Norse, and in German, the word V-U-R-D, Wort, and then in the Anglo-Saxon, sorry about the misspelling there, weird. And the word Campbell suggests, weird, is related to the German verb werden, to become or to grow, which suggests an inward inherent destiny, comparable essentially to Schopenhauer's concept of an intelligible character, which we'll explore now. But in addition to that, this wonderful association with the word of the old High German V-I-R-T, Wirt, or Wirtel, meaning spindle. And that brings the whole business of weaving and the spinning and weaving of the fates of destiny in the context of the Greek world. The little quotation at the bottom in the brackets is my addition to the conversation when I studied Anglo-Saxon poetry in England very briefly one summer. I was really drawn to the language, and the quotation there gives you a sense of the word from the Wanderer. It reads something like this: "Ne me werig mold weirde withståndan. Ne me werig mold weirde withståndan." and translated something like, neither may a weary mood withstand fate, essentially. And it's a very, very powerful poem. And it gives this notion of a kind of unavoidable destiny that compels our lives through thick and thin as a central concept of the world of Beowulf and Anglo-Saxon poetry. So moving farther down the line, closer to Jung, is this powerfully influential figure, the writings of Schopenhauer, which of course Jung would have known quite well. And anybody else working under the influence of the German Romantic philosophers of the 19th century, many of whom were engaged with studies in myth. But Campbell has extracted from Schopenhauer's writings material relevant to this notion of individuation, of an intelligible character with a metaphysical ground, which is unique to every individual and is essentially involved in the unfolding of one's destiny over time. And the consequent notion that every individual is the center of a mythology of his own, of which his own intelligible character is the incarnate God. So a very, very provocative, interesting aphoristic statement from Schopenhauer regarding the intelligible character with a metaphysical ground in the kind of territory in the interface between psyche and religion that Jung was so involved in, where the self becomes a kind of incarnate manifestation of a divine principle. And then this lovely final quote from Schopenhauer, who you'll see on the left, which for him was a good hair day, with this famous portrait. The apparent plan of the course of life might be explained to some extent as founded on the unchangeability and continuity of inborn character, just as those pictures called anamorphoses, which to the naked eye are only broken, fragmentary deformities, but when reflected in a conic mirror, show normal human forms. So the purely empirical interpretation of the world resembles seeing those pictures with naked eyes, while the recognition of the intention of fate resembles the reflection in the conic mirror, which binds together and organizes the disjointed, scattered fragments. With this fascinating word that Schopenhauer uses for this experience, anamorphoses, uh, meaning to form anew or to reshape. And the image here you'll see is a perfect embodiment of that idea in the postmodern paintings of Yakov Agam. And they're dynamic. And the way these things work is what you see in front of you now is a kind of chaotic fragment of colors and rectangles and so forth. But when you walk around the painting to the right, it will form a perfect line of three horizontal stripes. And then when you walk around the painting to the left, it will form a perfect line of three vertical lines. And this becomes the characteristic style of this marvelous artist, Yakov Agam, who you can find a lot about online. But the essential notion here, as Campbell points out, is that this idea of anamorphosis, to shape or make again or to form anew, clarifies a great deal in modern literature and art. As, for example, Joyce's title, Ulysses, for a novel about the wanderings round and about Dublin. The casual, chance, fragmentary events of an apparently undistinguished life disclose the form and dimension of a classic epic of destiny when the conic mirror is applied and our own scattered lives today as well are seen. also as anamorphosis. And this is a central doctrine of modernist literature, which Eliot called the mythical method. And the whole second half of Campbell's book is devoted to Joyce and Thomas Mann and Picasso with these particular aesthetic manifestations of these ideas. In the same section where he's talking about Schopenhauer's intelligible character and the notions of weird and fate, he alludes briefly to a man named Sir Arthur Keith, a somewhat complicated legacy we needn't go into. But the quotation from Arthur Keith is really interesting. If nature cannot reproduce the same simple pattern in any two fingers, how much more impossible is it for her to reproduce the same pattern in any two brains, the organization of which is inconceivably complex? Every child is born with a certain balance of faculties, aptitudes, inclinations, and instinctive leanings. In no two is the balance alike, and each different brain has to deal with a different type of experience. So there's this notion of a kind of physiological basis for the unique individuality that we all bring with us mysteriously into the world, and which is operative in the unfolding of our lives during the processes, as Jung would say, of individuation. And I was really delighted in Campbell when he brought Emerson into the conversation. Uh, the whole American transcendentalist movement of the mid-19th century with Emerson and Whitman and Melville and Hawthorne and Poe, Emily Dickinson farther down the line. A marvelous time in American culture, as difficult as it was. So here again, in the commentary, Campbell's notion that the new center and source of all truth and virtue, made known to us already in the courage and loyalty of Eloise, the prophecies of Joachim de Fiore, Grail Quest themes, Dante's Dream, and so forth. These are explored at some length in the rest of the book. The new center is for each of us his own or her own, and is made known from within. And this is very, very much consistent with essays by Emerson, including Self-Reliance, which has this wonderful quote that we live in succession, in divisions, in parts, in particles. Meantime, within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related and forms a kind of coherent center of the self, which, as Campbell points out, is comparable to the great theologian Paul Tillich's idea of the ground of being, which sounds Brahmanic with the Buddhist body of truth, except in the Western world, there is a dramatic emphasis on the personal, individual embodiment of the mystery as a value in itself. The personality of God is not in transcendence, out there, beyond thought, beyond personality, but here in this life, in its immanence, in the faces and personalities, loves and lives of all around us, in our friends, our enemies, and ourselves. And it's that notion of an individual, unique metaphysical ground that brings our processes of spiritual and psychological growth to fulfillment, distinguishes between, in Campbell's view at any rate, the Occidental world of the West, focusing on the individual, and the Oriental world of the East, focusing on the complete dissolution of the individual into the ground of being. So the Romantic movement is a great source of material. Now, this image with the quotation is Campbell's. The image is one that I thought of to accompany it, and it has to do with the nature of portraiture, whether it be a painting or a photograph. And in the quotation, the notion that a great portrait is the revelation through the empirical of the intelligible character of our being, whose ground is beyond comprehension. The work is an icon of a spirituality true to this earth and to its life, where it is the creatures of this world that the delectable mountains of our pilgrim's progress are discovered, and where the radiance of the city of God is recognized as man. The arts of Shakespeare and Cervantes are revelations, texts, and chapters of the actual living myth of our present developing humanity, which again focuses on that unique metaphysical ground of the intelligible character that we bring into the world with us. And these two portraits are from a well-known photographer named Joyce Tennyson in a book that some of you may know called Wise Women. Now, to continue with laying the ground of the rhizomatic energies from which the notion of individuation has emerged, if you can bear with me a little bit more with the reading to distinguish the development from Schopenhauer on, we have some very important quotations. First with Schopenhauer. The hidden power that directs and moves us toward its intended goals by means of the outward circumstances affecting us might yet have its roots within the very depths of our own unfathomable being. There is a hidden power to which all those accidents of the dream conform, which is actually directing and coordinating its incidents. Just as each of us is the hidden director of his own dreams, so may the fate that governs each of our lives proceed ultimately from that will, which, though it is our own, yet works its influence from a region far beyond the horizon of our individual perceiving consciousness. You can see why Jung and Mann and Joyce love Schopenhauer. Fate, as our guiding genius, our spirit dwelling outside of us, whose vision far outdistancing that of the individual consciousness, reveals itself as an inexorable outer coercion, preparing and controlling what, though it cannot be revealed to the individual, he must never get wrong. So what seems to be an external, inexorable outward coercion of the events of our lives is actually generated by this internal dynamic, the indwelling spirit of the intelligible character. And then this wonderful syllogism of the relationship between the dream and the dreamer and the manifold universe to the unknown energies from which it comes, which in our tradition is called God. Now, those notions lay the foundations, in my understanding, of the emergence of ideas of the self and individuation in both Jung and Hillman. And here I'm turning to the term daimon, meaning God or fate, denoting a lesser deity or guiding spirit, which are seen as the souls and forces of fate, similar to the Roman concept of the genius, a protective spirit for each individual. And that for Jung, the daimon is a metaphor for all those inner drives and aspects of the unconscious, the powerful force that guides our creativity, passion, and even our destructive tendencies. Often the case with the daimon generating circumstances in our lives that seem unbearably traumatic and painful and difficult, but very, very much a part of the unfolding of the dynamic of our unique individuality. And then many of you will know Hillman's Soul's Code, in which he uses the metaphor of the acorn from which the oak emerges, and the acorn as an innate potential or purpose that carries the blueprint for who we are meant to become. The daimon is the inner guide or spirit that ensures that we move toward our unique destiny despite or because of external circumstances and challenges. And I take this from one of my early books with this equation of the problem of the daimon as opposed to the demon. The idea that the energies within can often be experienced in a horrifically traumatic way, as would be the case in a breakdown, a divorce, a diagnosis of cancer. But out of that process comes a new dynamic psyche emerging related to these inner energies unfolding. We find this in Yeats too, in his book called A Vision. And I've taken a couple of quotations here from that wonderful book by James Olney, The Rhizome and the Flower, and then another book, which is about Yeats. Yeats called the shaping power behind an artist's life and work the daimon, which he understood as ancestral spirits of the dead come alive in the images of great poems. A rather remarkable sentence. The daimon is the intermediary spirit of the dead, informing the development of both the individual and of history itself. Each individual has a daimon proper to him or herself who shapes his life by creating a myth that unifies our being. And that these daimonic images typically emerge in apocalyptic times like the one we're going through, and which Yeats celebrated or focused on in his famous poem around the time of World War I, the Second Coming. So this adds a whole, really interesting dimension to the notion of an inner intelligible self and a guiding force of destiny by connecting it to the ancestral dead. Jung has this idea that we're living the unlived lives of our ancestors, and there are energies that are needing to be developed and fulfilled. Comes very close to Olney's description of the role of the daimon in Yeats. And Yeats famously applies this to the phases of the moon connected to the four stages of life, during the course of which the inner daimonic energies of the self manifest at different times in different ways in our lives, with a kind of ultimate movement towards a state of psychological fulfillment. So I have rushed through those quotations, but they are really central to this notion of the roots of the notion of individuation and the unique, intelligible inner character of the self, driving that process throughout the course of our lives. And Campbell begins with the Greeks and the Anglo-Saxons in his discussion of this issue, moving eventually to Schopenhauer. But he identifies, in his view, the key moment when these ideas about the unique integrity of the individual human being begin to emerge, in his view, for the first time in the European culture of the 12th and 13th century among the troubadour poets in France and the Minnesänger love poets of Germany, when the emphasis on love leads to a new sense of our place. And that then is continued, as we'll see, after our first break, with the Grail romances of Gottfried von Strasbourg and Wolfgang von Eschenbach. And this is really, where Campbell's whole career started, when he went to Paris to study Old French, and then on to Munich to study Middle High German. And this is the period of the Albigensian Crusades, late 12th, early 13th century, and revolving around the horrific campaign against this town, this fortified town, Carcassonne, and the tragic, bloody, brutal suppression of the Templar movements in the south of France. And an early poet of the troubadour tradition who was patronized by the king and queen of Carcassonne. And you'll see an image of the queen, a carcass on the right there, with a wonderful story about her saving the city. But it's the key point that Campbell makes here that is of importance for our subject. In the love lyrics of the troubadours, even where analogies to certain religious motifs would seem to be obvious, mythological references are ignored, and the poem remains frankly and wholly secular, with the poet as the devotee of his lady, who is radiant and potent, not by analogy, but with the brilliance and grace of her own that is sufficient for life in this world. And the celebration of that relationship in the troubadours and the Minnesinger poets that occupies a significant section of this wonderful book on creative mythology. This distinction, you're probably very familiar with, different notions of love emerging in the romances of the Middle Ages, with both Eros and agape having a kind of impersonal quality. Eros as the erotic impulse, what Campbell called the zeal of the organs for each other, which can be an impersonal dynamic, I've been told. Agape is a brotherly love, sisterly love for the community. And there again, it's impersonal. It doesn't matter who your neighbor is. You're supposed to love them, according to the New Testament, which everybody ignores. And then finally, Campbell offers this third term, amour, which is much more central to our notion of an individual dynamic between two particular people, which then becomes the focus for the unfolding of the self and the discovery of our spiritual roots and a fulfillment of the psychological dynamic of our relationships. So there's this wonderful quotation from Campbell. Nobody in a pulpit seems ever to have heard of amour as a third selective discriminating principle, in contrast to the other two. The consecration of this love was not an ecclesiastical affair of bell, book, and clergy, but a matter purely of the character and sentiments of the couple involved. And finally, the mad disciplines to which a lover might, in the name of love, subject himself sometimes approach the lunacies of a penitential grove. That's a wonderful summation of the sorts of bizarre willingness of the lover to undergo extreme sufferings in the service of the beloved in the penitential grove. But the key point then would be that amour is not subject to the authorities of the church or the state, but finds within itself the central humanistic source of value right here in this world, in our dynamic relationships between each other. And he takes great pains at this point in his conversation about the troubadours to distinguish it from the Denis de Rougemont's book, Love in the Western World, who argues that the troubadours were Gnostic Manichaean, with the radical separation of psyche and nature, and a dramatic rejection of the world of the flesh and of the natural world and of sexuality. And this he challenges that view to suggest that the troubadours in the Tristan story and in Gottfried's work, nature in its noblest moment, the realization of love, is an end and glory in itself, and the senses ennobled and refined by courtesy and art, temperance, loyalty, and courage are the guides to this realization. Like a flower potential in its seed, the blossom of the realization of love is potential in every heart, or at least in every noble heart, and requires only proper cultivation to be fostered to maturity. Hence, if the courtly cult of amour is to be cataloged according to its heresy, it should be indexed rather as Pelagian rather than Gnostic or Manichaean. So the Gnostic and Manichaean view would reject this notion of the ultimate nobility of law, of nature and the senses and of love as a source of fulfillment. And the connection to the Pelagians is a really quite interesting one, because the Pelagians rejected the whole doctrine of original sin and taught that we finally have no need of supernatural grace, since our nature itself is full of grace. No need of a miraculous redemption, but only of awakening and maturation. In the lyrics of the troubadours, we hear little or nothing of the fall and corruption, either of the senses or of the world. So this is the key moment in Campbell's view in European culture, with this movement towards what would become a very humanistic approach to the value of the individual in the context of love and relationship. And that, of course, is the central theme for many of the troubadour poets. And I've only added a few here without having time to dwell on them in any detail. Giraud de Bornay here with love entering through the eyes and cementing a relationship that fosters the fulfillment of each individual in the context of the relationship. And one of a beautiful illuminated manuscript there on the left of his poem. And Campbell's commentary is what's most critical here about the troubadours. We've here entered new ground, such ground as in the whole course of our long survey of the world's primitive, Oriental, and Occidental traditions has not been encountered before. It is the ground, unique and new, on which stands the modern, self-reliant individual. So he's referring here to the first 3 volumes of the Mass of God, and the notion that to create a mythology is a breakaway moment occurring here in the 12th and 13th century, with the emphasis on the individual dynamic in the relationship of amour. The German word that Campbell focuses on here with this Minnesänger poet, and one of these beautiful pages from a manuscript of the poets in a library in Munich, and the commentary on the notion of Minna. It took a German to recognize in the world transfiguring sentiment of love as Minna, amour, an experience of that same transcendent, immanent ground of being, beyond duality, which Schopenhauer, 6 centuries later, was to celebrate in his philosophy. We've already taken note of Gottfried von Strasbourg in relationship to the symbolism of love, and then in Walther's poems also, the revelation of the goddess Minna to a metaphysical depth beyond anything suggested either in the Provençal or the old French love poetry of the day. So when we're moving from the troubadours to the Minnesänger, there's this very, very mystical sense of the depths of the relationship, the metaphysical depths of the relationship associated with the goddess Minna, who is quite remarkably described in this quotation from Walter van der Vogelweide. Minna is neither male nor female. She has neither a soul nor a body. She resembles nothing imaginable. Her name is known, herself, however, ungrasped. Yet nobody from her apart merits the blessing of God's grace. A quite remarkable statement regarding the divine energies of love.
Hey, Siri.
I'm sorry. So I'm almost finished with this part of the troubadours, at which point we'll be able to take a break. But I wanted to continue with these important quotations. Here is the famous Blue Virgin from Chartres. It's a spectacular stained glass window. And the worship of Virgin Mary emerged at this time in the ecclesiastical context. at the same time that the worship of the divine feminine was emerging in the poems of the troubadours. And the ironic sense that there was a carnage in the religious warfare all surrounding the cathedrals, with the campaigns against the heretics of the Templars in the Albigensian world and so forth. And in the midst of all this, the notion that the world can be redeemed through the mechanism of that woman shining like the sun, associated with the Mother of God in her role as the merciful mother, as the source of redemption from the catastrophic events that were occurring at this time, very much like our times with Gaza and Ukraine, horrific things going on. So one consolation, of course, is in the church. However, as Campbell points out, the troubadours, the minnesingers, the epic poets of the century, in their celebration of amour, remained, in Nietzsche's sense, true to this earth, this vale of tears, where the devil roams for the ruin of souls. For in their view, not heaven, but this blossoming earth was to be recognized as the true domain of love, as it is of life. And the corruption, ruinous of love, was not of nature, of which love is the very heart, but of society, both lay and ecclesiastical, the public order, and most immediately, its sacramentalized loveless marriages. So the notion that the troubadours found fulfillment in love, in relationships that we experience during the course of our lives, which fostered the fulfillment and the movement of our individuation process. So it may be a good time to pause for questions before we proceed to the romances of Gottfried and Wolfgang von Eschenbach. So I think what I will do at this point, it's about 5 minutes to 11, is to stop the share and respond to anybody who has put a question in the chat or would simply like to raise their hand. And Krista is going to help moderate this part of the morning.
Okay, so there is something in the chat from Hermenia Gomez. Would you like to read your question?
Yes, thank you. I had read that fate is given to us, but that destiny is determined by the choices we make within that fate. I don't know if I misunderstood, but it seems that fate and destiny are being used interchangeably in the presentation. Can you clarify fate and destiny as the same or different, even though they are related to each other?
Well, you did it much more beautifully than I can do. So if you can just repeat the distinction that you made between the two.
Fate is given to us, as in we are born into a certain era, historical period, to certain parents. I'm adding that, I'm sorry. That fate is given to us, but that destiny is determined by the choices we make within that fate.
You're treading on complicated, wonderful material. It would certainly go back to the Greeks. This is a preoccupation, and I'm substituting fate and free will as a kind of analogy to what you're saying, and the notion that the plays, particularly the tragedies, develop a kind of focus on that problem of fate versus free will. In the tragedies, with the central character being, of course, Oedipus, and the efforts to, let's say, escape his fate lead to the fulfillment of his destiny, or something like that. But I am using them perhaps two indiscriminately in relationship to each other. So thank you for the clarification.
Thank you. I didn't mean to clarify. I just wanted some clarification. Thank
Well,
you.
you're welcome.
If you have a question, please go down to the bottom and raise your hand using the signal in the chat. And that'll bring it, or not in the chat, but down at the bottom where it says react. Or if you would like, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
And if not, I can simply proceed for a few more minutes before we have our stretch.
Great. And just a reminder, please, if you need CE credits to keep your cameras on throughout the presentation. And then there's an Abigail, she, her, but I don't have a last name. And I do see Abigail Nelson, but I don't know if that's your other thing or if it's somebody else. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I see.
Hey, sorry.
The slide question, at least. The presentation is being recorded, so you'd be able to go back through it and stop on that slide with Yeats and the stages of life. Other questions or comments?
I have a question. And also, I
Yes.
just want to clarify that Other Abigail's my audio because I couldn't connect it to my computer.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of going on a deep dive on Sumerian mythology.
Yeah.
And I guess in general, I just wonder the timeline of most Jungian work and beyond that, kind of starting in Greek or Roman mythology.
Mm-hmm.
Just
Well,
why that is.
one of the breakthrough Jungian books with Sylvia Pereira was called Descent to the Goddess, back 20, 30, maybe even 40 years ago. And it focuses on the Sumerian mythology of the descent of the goddess Inanna into the underworld. And it's absolutely critically important, central to the whole conversation of myth. And it would take us back to about 2000 BC, in a process of development from the Akkadians and the Babylonians and the Sumerians, as obviously well in advance of the golden age of Athens and the emergence of European culture. But it has been a very important book for the Jungian world, and the myth of Inanna has remained central to the conversation in many quarters of the Jungian communities. And the Sylvia Pereira's book is quite wonderful. It's really it's a myth probably written by a woman, a priestess of Inanna, and it tells the story of a woman's journey. And it's our very first crucifixion story. It is so interesting. The text that I use in graduate school was co-edited by Samuel Noah Kramer and a storyteller named Diane Volkstein. And it's a lovely, affordable paperback called The Queen of Heaven. But it's been updated now with new publications by a woman named Meador, Meador, more current in the conversations in the Jungian world about that particular myth, Betty Jo Meador, and the title is Enhuadana, which I will not attempt to spell at this point. So thank you for the question, Abigail. How are we doing with other responses to this barrage of quotations I've inflicted upon you? But they really are worth dwelling on and going back and reading again. We have a few minutes before 11:15, so Krista, if there are no other comments, maybe I'll start to pick up with where we're headed.
Yes,
with
go
moving
ahead.
from the troubadours to the romances.
No other questions in the chat and no other hands raised.
We'll have some time, of course, for questions as we proceed. So around the same time that the troubadour poets were emerging in the south of France and the Minnesingers, 12th and 13th century, in their short lyric poems of love, probably impacted by the Islamic, Persian, Arabic traditions coming into southern Italy and southern Spain to influence a particular kind of love poetry, we have the emergence of the so-called romances, the Grail quests with more extended narratives to develop the various experiences of the different knights and ladies of the Round Table. This is another one of those wonderful illustrations, a tapestry of the pre-Raphaelites, Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris, and illustrating frequently themes from the medieval Grail romances. And here the knights are departing and the ladies are staying behind. And that, of course, brings a problem into the room. What happens to the women in these stories? And I have one solution to that question when we get to Wolfram. But at any rate, the key point here in the caption is Campbell's quotation from one of the French romances called The Quest of the Holy Grail. And the quotation is, each one went the way upon which he had decided, and they set out into the forest at the point where they saw it darkest, for they thought it would be a disgrace to set forth in a group. So here we have that notion of the individual experience of the quest and the movement into the unknown regions of the deep unconscious and an exploration of the images that emerge during the course of the journey on an individual basis. And this becomes the central theme of the romances, and most particularly in the large volume Creative Mythology, you have these two poets represented at considerable length in the book. And one is Gottfried von Strasbourg's version of the story of Tristan and Isolde, and it is far and away, hands down, the great masterpiece of all of those poets who attempted to retell the story of Tristan. It's a magnificent reading experience. And on the right here, you'll see where we're headed after our first break to the work of Wolfram von Eschenbach, his Parsifal of about 1220. And Campbell's commentary here is critical to our central theme for the day of the individuation process. So he points out that in the German biographical epics, the sens and the matière was applied, and by sens he means the thesis or sense. Matter is the material, the actual content of the stories. And he's taking those phrases from Chrétien de Troyes in his preface to one of his romances. Sens, the meaning, matter, the material. And in the case of the biographical epics, not for political or courtly ideals, nor ecclesiastical churchly teaching, but psychological in the modern sense of treating spiritual initiations generally available in this world and inevitable to anyone sensitive to his own unfolding realizations of the mystery of existence. So this distinction is a very important one in the move towards the psychological development of the unfolding adventures of the central characters, representing essentially what we would recognize as an individuation process, which we're going to explore with Wolfram von Eschenbach after the break. In Wolfram, the guide is within, for each unique. And I see in this the first completely intentional statement of the fundamental mythology of modern Western man, the first sheerly individualistic mythology in the history of the human race, a mythology of quest inwardly motivated, directed from within, where there is no authorized way or guru to be followed or obeyed, but where for each all ways already found, known, and proven are the wrong ways, since they are not his own. For each in himself, in his intelligible character, an unprecedented species in himself, whose life can be revealed and realized only by and through himself. So you'll see this wonderful image of Wolfram involved in what Campbell will eventually call the secularization of myth, where the mythical images are applied to the dynamics of psychological and spiritual growth as they occur in this world as the central theme. And you'll notice this page from the collection of poems in Munich of Wolfram von Eschenbach on the right, at least it's on the right of my computer, with the heraldry of knighthood that he was associated with. And Campbell points out a very important point for us as we make our way into that material, having to do with the penetration beyond the opposites, with the peculiar heraldic kind of double-bladed axe on the helmet of the knight, and then again on his banner. You'll see the same motif. And for Campbell, this indicates the central problem in Wolfram is going between the opposites, the reconciliation of the oppositions that are predominant in the poem. And among those oppositions, as we'll see, is the dramatic opposition between the European Christianity and the Islamic traditions, the Persian traditions of the Middle East. And they, of course, this is the time of the Crusades, and those oppositions will be resolved and reconciled in a very unique way in Wolfram's poem, which we can very selectively explore. The focus on Tristan and Isolde offers too much of the text to be able to go into today, a well-known story. Perhaps you know it from Wagner's wonderful opera. And the commentary, again, focuses on this central notion of the universally popular mythological theme known to folklore scholarship as the infant exile and return, carries in the legend of Tristan's boyhood, as wherever it occurs, the inherent suggestion of a destiny unfolding, like a seed into a flower, ineluctably in the incidents of a life. The romance rests mythological forms which emerge with increasing force. The sense is of the force of destiny in the shaping of a life. And these are the words that Campbell uses. Or to use the old Germanic term of weird, equating the notion of weird, the unfolding of destiny and fate. The illustration on the left is these beautiful stained glass windows, which were designed by William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones, here illustrating the infant exile of Tristan when he's taken from his mother after his father is slain in battle. But our focus is going to be on Wolfram. As a Minnesänger poet, rather famous for this battle of the poets, the Sängerkrieg, in the castle of the Wartburg in Germany, which is the setting for Wagner's opera, Tannhäuser, I believe. And on the left, this famous gathering of the poets, of which Wolfram was one, with the short lyric poetry of the Minnesänger tradition. And this you can find in that collection in Munich. It's a marvelous collection with the Minnesänger poet on the left and a quotation from one of the poems on the right. And it's one of those little miniature books one can purchase when one travels to Munich. Or now you travel to Amazon.com. You can probably find this little Minnesänger collection. So what I would like to do now is add my own particular contribution to the conversation about individuation and the unfolding of that process in the Grail romances. And I'm going to use the language of complex and archetype with the notion of a movement from one to the other in the poetry, in the dramatic unfolding of the adventures of the particular night. And I am going to start with Percival, or Parsifal, as he's called in German, to illustrate this notion of the movement from complex to archetype. And I'm taking that phrase basically from a book that many of you may well know, Edward Whitmont's book called The Symbolic Quest, one of two books in which he talks about the romances of the Middle Ages. The other one is called The Return of the Goddess in Edward Whitmont's book. And it develops the notion that what happened, Middle Ages were so important in the romances for the recovery and the redemption of the feminine on the one hand, and then farther down the line in the Jungian discourse, the problem of the reconciliation of good and evil, along with the reconciliation of male and female. And Ed Whitmont's books are really quite wonderful. I don't know if he ever spoke at the Institute. So that's where I'd like to move. It's 11:15 at this point, and why don't we stop for that cappuccino and eggs Benedict from the corner bakery and come back fully refreshed and ready to go. And I'm very grateful if you do come back. So
Please state. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
does that sound 10, 15 minutes? What should we say?
Let's come back at 11:25. Does that sound good? 10 minutes?
Sounds good.
All right,
Yeah.
everyone, please stay logged in and you can turn your cameras off for the break. All right, thank you. We'll be back at 11:25.
Thank you. So shall we proceed into the dark forest of the mysteries? So the narrative of Wolfgang von Eschenbach's Parsifal is a completion of the story as begun by Chrétien in his French romance of the story of the Grail, which is the first time the word Grail appears. And it seems that right from the start, it was of great interest to such readership as was there at that time, which would include largely, of course, an aristocratic audience, but also the great tradition of oral storytelling, where the minstrels and the troubadours would tell these stories to the accompaniment of a musical instrument. And the widespread popularity of the stories is, indicated by this beautiful ivory from the Louvre in the medieval room, which is the medieval wing of the Louvre, is absolutely marvelous. It's a place to go to escape the crowds who are all trying to see the Mona Lisa. And right beneath the medieval rooms are these spectacular rooms where you'll find Sumerian, Babylonian cylinder seals and the beautiful Cyclotic goddesses and so forth. So a highly recommended excursion the next time you happen to be in Paris and can go to the Louvre. So I mentioned this notion of complex to archetype, and there's this idea that, riffing on a phrase of Harold Bloom, who famously said that Freud was Shakespeare in prose. And one is tempted to say that Jung is Wolfgang von Eschenbach in prose, because so much of the dynamic of Jungian individuation is exemplified in this story, and particularly in Wolfram's completion of the story. This page gives you some sense of the complex aspect of the psychology of Percival, who is being raised by his mother deep in the woods of Wales, as far away from the court as possible, because she is mourning the loss of her husband and of several relatives, and does not want her boy to become a knight. So she's brought him up with this ridiculous clothing, and he sees knights one day in the forest and says he wants to be a knight, and rides off to the Arthurian court on an old broken down nag and a kind of ridiculous country hick sort of outfit, and the lances that he likes to hunt with. And before he leaves, his mother has given him some very, very bad advice, particularly regarding women. She tells him if he should happen to stumble upon a young lady, that he should steal her ring and steal a kiss. And this is the very first thing that happens, and it is a disastrous for that young woman and her mate. And on the other hand, she's also sent him off in this absurd outfit to go to King Arthur's court, with a clear notion that it's not a particularly strategic way to advance oneself in the court. So he becomes known as the belle inconnue in French, the beautiful unknown, or the fool, tarot fool, or the einfache Mensch in German, the simple fool. And when unbeknownst to him, when he leaves, his mother commits suicide, jumping here off of a bridge. So by the time he gets to Arthur's court as an adolescent, he's come bearing a pretty heavy burden of responsibilities that he's essentially unaware of, including killing one of his cousins at the behest of Arthur. So it is a very interesting portrait of this complex relationship between the mother and the son. And the relation and that attachment between the two is indicated by this weird outfit. When he gets to Arthur's court, he kills the Red Knight, and he wants to take the Red Knight's armor and horse, which he does, but he refuses to take off this ridiculous outfit that his mother has made for him, which he continues to wear under his armor. And then again, when he rides down the road to his first castle experience with a man named Gournemans, he refuses to initially to remove the clothing. He's eventually persuaded to do so, but as soon as he says he wants to go back and go home and see his mother. So he rides off in search of his mother and ends up at the castle of his wife-to-be. The search for the mother leads to the wife, and the enduring attachment between the son and the mother, which I'm calling a mother complex somewhat simplistically, is indicated again after he's married. After a few days, he says, I want to go back home and see mom, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks. But this time, when he rides off from the castle of his wife, who is called Conduire Amours in German, and more beautifully, Blanche Fleur, white flower in French. This time, when he rides off in search of his mother, he comes to the Grail Castle, and it's a critical turning point in the story and begins that movement from what I'd like to see as the complex to the archetype. And it's at this point in the story where these profound archetypal images of the deep psyche, particularly in the European sphere, begin to emerge in the narrative. And the first is the image of the Fisher King, who directs Parsifal to the Grail Castle. And what you see on the screen is one of the Hellenistic mystery bowls called the Pietroasa bowl that 800 AD or so, that Campbell addresses at some considerable length in his discussion of the precursors and backgrounds of the iconographies of the Grail romances of the Middle Ages. So naturally, it's very tempting for him to see this central figure holding a cup as a kind of Grail maiden. And in the whole cycle, here you'll see her from above, in the whole cycle, there's an initiation rite that occurs in association with various Hellenistic deities, primarily Demeter and Persephone. But the very first figure, this is Apollo with his lyre, the very first figure in the bowl as it moves in this direction is Orpheus the fisher with a bag of fish and a pole here. And Campbell would often refer to this in a book by a man named Robert Eisler, Eisler, called Orpheus the Fisher, and explores this iconography, connecting Orpheus to the dynamics of spiritual revelation in these underground mystery religions during the late Hellenistic period in Yugoslavia and Bulgaria and parts of Greece. That symbolism, and this is the wonderful thing about Campbell's book, and one of the things that makes it so useful for Jungian analysis, is they'll take an image like the fisherman and track it back, returning it to the oldest manifestations of the mythologies, to a kind of primordial archetype, manifesting itself very, very early on, as in this Assyrian fish god standing beside the tree of life on the either side in their fish garbs, and the symbolism of what would become in the Persian world Ahura Mazda as the central deity in that context. And then on the right, you'll see a Babylonian version of the warder of the fish from the second millennium BC. So one is perhaps most familiar with this motif from the New Testament, where Christ becomes the fisher of men. But the New Testament comes at the end of a long lineage of symbolism of fishing. There's a great example in the Arabian Nights that we don't have time to look at right now. Here is a Christian, sorry about the typo there. Here is the Christian manifestations of the symbolism of fish and fishing with a oil lamp from one of the catacombs in Rome, which shows us Christ emerging from the fish, rather like Jonah, in a way that's very close to those fisher deities in the Assyrian image. And then this fascinating image from around the time that the Grail romances were beginning to appear in France and Germany, of God the Father fishing to catch the devil in the form of the Leviathan in the deeps. And the bait on the hook is Christ on the cross, as you'll see here. And then these images are what we used to call in Virginia when we went fishing in the creeks, sinkers, little weights attached to the line to hold it down. And this is the lineage of the House of David associated with Jesus. So you get this sense of the appearance of the Fisher King having something to do with the dynamics of the soul and spiritual revelation, but in Wolfram in a rather secularized context without ecclesiastical associations. Here's just another image of the symbolism of fishing appearing in a very beautiful document that's in the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York, the Hours of Catherine of Cleves, Cleves. And there's a wonderful facsimile that you can get by going online, and you can get the whole set of images from the text. And there's many spectacular ones. But this one, of course, shows this association between the Christian iconographies of the books of Hours and that of the Fisherman of Souls. Now, I mentioned that Percival had, shortly after his marriage with Blanchefleur Condrieu-Mors, had told his wife he wanted to go back to see his mother. And this is on the way to the Grail Castle where he actually sees the Fisher King. And then when he gets to the Grail Castle, you have this dramatic shift from the complex to the archetype. And this occurs in a very detailed, elaborate description of the Grail procession that occurs in Wolfram's poem. It's much more elaborately developed than a similar scene in Chrétien, which shows the Grail procession and the same character, Percival, both of whom neglect to ask the question that will heal the Grail King. But what you'll see here is a slide that I tried to put together of the seating arrangement for this Grail banquet that proceeds when Percival arrives coming from his marriage bed directly to the Grail Castle. And you can very quickly see its relevance to the study of mandala symbolism in Jung's work, with the situation of 100 tables at each of the four corners, with 400 knights, 4 knights per table, sitting. And in the center of this large medieval banquet hall is where the Grail King and the Grail Queen, the Grail Princess, the Grail Maiden, will be situated in the place that I've inserted this image of the Grail Maiden with the Grail. And as they sit down to dinner, this elaborate procession occurs with women who come dressed in different colored silks, all identified with particular regions in the Arabic and Persian world. And they all come in certain groups. And many of them carry important objects, such as the table that the Grail will be put on, and some very sharp knives and candles and so forth. And they all line up on either side of the Grail King and Maiden in the center, giving us a quite evocative manifestation of the mandala symbolism. And from an archetypal perspective, this arrangement is also extremely evocative, with the 12 maidens on one side and the 12 maidens on the other, and the central figure of the Grail Maiden in the center. And one can work with all of these numbers, of course, as others have done. But in a very simple way, one can see this as an embrace of the oppositions revolving around the number 12 as associated with the diurnal cycle of the 12 hours of the day and the 12 hours of the night on either side. And one can also think of a larger cycle with the precession of the signs of the zodiac. And in the central mystery there, embracing the opposites of day and night, good and evil, male and female, is the figure of Réponse de Choix, as she's called in Wolfram, of the Grail Maiden as an archetypal manifestation of the feminine, embracing the opposites. And this is the key theme in Campbell and a very important theme for Jung. And of course, the most important oppositions that are facing us today are, of course, those between good and evil, between God and the devil. The effort to integrate what some Jungians call radical evil, and how do we integrate that energy within ourselves and within the world. So you can see that the imagery at this point has shifted rather dramatically from the mother complex of the badly dressed boy who goes off to become a knight, stumbling along the way in his relationship with women, killing a cousin and not knowing it. And then after the marriage, this manifestation of a deeper level of the psyche associated with the archetypal energies of the collective. Now, as you know, probably he doesn't ask the question that will heal the Grail King, whose name is Amfortas, because he's been told not to ask questions. It would be not mannerly to do so. And part of his social education, that children should be seen and not heard. So he does not ask the question, and the result is expelled from the Grail Castle the next morning and continues on his journey and has a very, very important encounter with a hermit, an anchorite from the deep woods, whose name is Trevisan. And this represents a key moment in the hero journey model of an encounter with the wise old man who discloses the mysteries of the identity of the hero or heroine, and offers critical information to understanding the nature of destiny. And this all occurs in this marvelous chapter devoted to Trevisan. And we don't really have time to go into all of the details, but typical of the hero journey cycle, Parsifal finds out what his family background is. He's related to the Grail King. And he gets this whole story of how Amfortas was wounded by a heathen knight when Amfortas went to joust for love and was wounded dramatically by a pagan knight from the Middle East with a spear and a sharp tip that gets implanted in his groin as a sexual wound. And Amfortas is not supposed to fight for love as the Grail King, but we'll later find out who he's fighting for. And that complicates the story as well. So it's a wonderful chapter. It's chapter 9 in the text. And we also find out where the story of the Grail itself came from. It's said to be a translation of a mysterious person named Quixote. Scholars for many years assumed he was made up by Wolfram, but a recent couple named Kahane have argued that Quixote was in fact a real figure, and the story of the Grail was found in an Arabic text in Toledo by a character called Phlegetonus, who is a Jewish on one side of his family and a Muslim on the other. And then to top it off, he's converted to Christianity. So the story of the Grail comes from Phlegetonus and indicates that key problem of the reconciliation of political and cultural oppositions, that are dominating the European Middle Ages. And good Lord, it seems we haven't solved that problem of the relationship between the Arabs, the Jews, and the Christians. This is devastating, ongoing trauma. So there's a lot of information that comes here. And important for us is Wolfram's unique presentation of the Grail. In the ecclesiastical writings, the Grail is the chalice of the Last Supper. In Chrétien, the Grail is simply a serving dish studded with gemstones. But in Wolfram, the Grail is a stone It's a gemstone that has fallen from the heavens during the battle, the war in heaven between God and the rebel angels. And on that occasion, a gemstone is knocked out of one of the crowns and brought down to earth by neutral angels who have not sided either on God's side or on Satan's side. Hence, moving between, reconciling the oppositions of those two forces as a key theme for the whole book. Here on the left, you'll see one of the manuscripts in Basel, I believe it is. Basel has a wonderful initiative called the Parsifal Project. And they're really lovely, in this case, hand-painted, handwritten manuscripts of the story of Parsifal. Here, in counting the wise anchorite Trebizond. And the commentary, not only for Campbell, but for others, suggests that having the Grail as a stone brings the whole subject of alchemy into the poem, along with the Hermetic mysteries of the Kabbalah in one of the sources that Campbell quotes. So alchemy becomes a very important central theme here in this particular image of the Grail, and the whole dynamic process of individuation is connected to the unfolding of the character, the central character of Parsifal. Some of you may know the book, The Grail Legend, that Emma worked on, Emma Jung, for much of her life, and then was completed by Marie-Louise von Franz from a stack of incoherent notes, basically. And somewhere along the way, von Franz says that Wolfram really got this whole story better because he knew alchemy. And it's at this point in around 1200 or so, with Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, that alchemy was becoming very central to this tradition of cultural imagery and poetry from this period on. And that brings a whole nother topic for exploration in Campbell's book, in which alchemy does play an important role. Without dwelling on it too much, this connection between Trebizond and a prophetic figure named Joachim de Flores from around that critical time, late 12th century, relevant to the emerging notion of a human spiritual energy, is in this transition of what he called the three ages. The Father, the Old Testament of Mosaic law, the Son, associated with the Gospels and the Church, and then a final phase associated with the Spirit, when there will be no church, only an earthly paradise ruled by saints, and the elimination of any need whatsoever for any kind of ecclesiastical structure to provide guidance and orientation because of the intimate, immediate connection to the energies of the divine spirit within each one of us. And you can see this as a kind of proto-Protestant view, dispensing the sacraments of the church and focusing on the individual relationship to God through the reading of the New Testament. Now, I couldn't find a good picture, oddly enough, of the Grail stone brought down by the neutral angels. But very recently, in the New York Times, there were these fascinating articles about diamonds and advertisements for the De Beers Diamond Company. A terribly controversial subject given the human atrocities associated with the diamond trade, under Cecil Rhodes in South Africa. But the pictures were too tempting for me not to do screen capture and provide this image, in this case, of a diamond shaped in the form of a downward pointed triangle which would represent that fall from one of the celestial circles of the heavens, coming down to Earth and becoming the source of the Grail mythology in Wolfram's poem. Now, I thought this might be useful to you as well as a therapist. In this fascinating section of Revelation with Trebizond of how the Grail King's wound is tended with efforts to heal and to alleviate the pain of a genital wound that becomes unbearably painful and cold at certain key points in the cycles of Saturn. There's a lot of astrology in Wolfram's poem. And when that suffering becomes intolerable, the only remedy that helps is to take the spear tip with which he was wounded and insert the spear into the open genital wound, and then to remove it. And when it comes out, excuse me, it's covered with ice that's so thick that only a special pair of knives from the spine of fish that swim in the Tigris-Euphrates rivers can cut the ice off. This is another example of Wolfram's extraordinary, innovative, creative genius with these motifs that come in, and they are profoundly archetypal. So the remedies for the Grail's wound, none of them particularly effective, include a carbuncle, red stone in the lore of the unicorn. It's to be found at the base of the unicorn horn. And on the left, you'll see the cloisters tapestries from New York and the mythology of the unicorn, who removes poisons, purifies the waters by inserting the horn. So an appropriate sense of purification as a remedy for the Grail King. And I couldn't resist including this gorgeous painting by Raphael of the Virgin with the little unicorn in her lap. Isn't that just splendid? She's not the Virgin Mary, but an aristocratic maiden. The other remedies are also equally interesting. Proposed to heal the Grail King's wound is the golden bough from Virgil's Aeneid, when he goes down into the underworld with the help of the golden bough, harvested from the oak grove connected to his mother, Venus. And then the other remedy is the pelican blood. And you'll see this image of mosaic of the pelican feeding its young with its own blood, which was a symbol in the Grail romances of Christ, with the healing power connected to it, and hence a very important archetypal motif in the context of the culture of the time. So in the narrative, which is almost a kind of postmodern narrative, it goes back and forth in time and space, and the stories are interlaced with each other in the most extraordinary, skillful way. It's at this point, when Parsifal has gone off on his long 5-year journey after leaving the Grail castle, that the narrative shifts to Wolfram's Gawain. And in my opinion, Gawain completely steals the show. It is so interesting when his journey begins in Arthur's court and sets off on what will also become a kind of a Grail quest. And one of the most famous episodes from where we're headed now with Gawain is the episode of the perilous bed that he has to sleep on and break the spell of the wizard Klingsor. And this particular artist, in a very clever way, has juxtaposed that motif from the story of Lancelot crossing the sword bridge in his efforts to retrieve Guinevere from the wizardly knight Meleagant. So these images of the perilous bed, the lion, and the maidens, I want to explore now in the little bit of time that we have left. And in order to do that, I would like to offer my own particular contribution to the conversation about myth and archetype in the Jungian context and in Campbell's work. And I like to refer to a particular set of images associated with the journey to the underworld as necrotypes. So I combine nekia and archetype, and with the simple suggestion that these are images that will spontaneously emerge in dreams and poems and films or whatever, whenever the myth of the journey to the underworld comes into the text. And so this is a very old PowerPoint from a long time ago, which gives us some sense of the different kinds of images, astronomical, zoomorphic, so forth. And after working with this for many years, I suddenly realized that many of these journeys to the underworld involve an encounter with the archetypal feminine as that figure that presides over the underworld in the way that we know from the Sumerian myths. And so I've adapted that with this coinage of necrogynotypes, images associated with the great goddesses of the tradition, emerging spontaneously in the narrative or in the dream when the journey to the underworld becomes a central narrative motif. And you'll see here with this hexagonal mandala, only a few of the kinds of images that are characteristic of the necrogynotypes that emerge in the poems. So what I'd like to do in our movement from the complex to the archetype is to explore the imagery that emerges in association with Gawain in the second half of the poem and his encounter with this extraordinary female protagonist named Orgelouse, whose name is related to the French word for pride. And the reason for that is that right from the get-go, when Gawain first falls immediately in love with her, she's incredibly abusive. No matter what he does, it is responded to with the disdain and verbal abuse, relentless verbal abuse, coming from the woman that he's decided to enter into relationship with. Now, I can't imagine that in the Jungian world of psychotherapy, you all can't think of similar situations where we get involved with people who are incredibly abusive. And why do we stay in those relationships? What is it that keeps us in them? And why do the people behave in this outrageous way? All of these issues are very much a part of Wolfram's poem. Hence that sense of Wolfram as a precursor, of Jung. So we have time to explore a few of these archetypal images with my own amplifications from the text to bring the work forward in a new way. So the encounters as Gawain proceeds on his journey includes initially finding a severely wounded knight named Urien in the lap of a nameless lady who's been wounded by a man named Li Shua. And among Gawain's abilities are those of herbal remedies. So he's able to tend this knight who is wounded, lying in the lap of the lady. And after he does that, almost right when he's healing this wounded knight, he sees the castle of Orgelouse on the top of a mountain with a spiral pathway, sitting under a tree from which a spring of water flows. And he's immediately smitten by her, and her first task for him is to retrieve a Norwegian white pony from across the creek from her castle. And he's warned off by everybody not to go there, but nevertheless, he does. So what I have here are images from, this one's from Campbell, and this is another source, of this archetypal dimension of Orgeluse at the top of a mountain with a spring of water flowing forth from her. And in this particular case, this is a Minoan seal ring. It's got the symbol of the labyrinth behind it, so which is a very interesting. And the lady on the top of the mountain, which I call an oreographic necrotype, because magic mountains are typically part of the journey. She's flanked on either side by lions, which I call the feline necrotype or necrogynotype. And on this side, you'll see the three Hesperides with the tree and the three vessels and water flowing out from the base of the tree. And in this case, of course, tended by the serpent Ladon that Hercules will eventually encounter. So these are archetypal images of the feminine that are manifesting themselves in Wolfram's poem and the description of the setting for Orgeluse. And this particular page, after seeing Orgeluse, he returns to the lady whose knight has been healed and then has to joust with Urians. But at any rate, the image of a knight severely wounded lying in the lap of a woman naturally, in the context of European Christianity, would evoke the Pietà. Mary as the mother, the Madonna, and Mary as the Pietà. She's the womb and the tomb, Madonna and Pietà. And so that is the territory of the archetypal feminine that Gawain is now wandering into. This image from the Basel manuscript is from an earlier episode devoted to Percival, where he also finds a knight lying in the lap of a lady as a central symbol of the archetypal feminine on their journey. I couldn't find an appropriate image apart from this one of the Glastonbury tour with the tower at the top of this wonderful hill with the spiral-like pathway that leads up to the top, and which Gawain experiences as spinning, spiraling around, with the lady sitting at the top beside the spring and asking for her horse. Now, the horse is what I would call equine gynotype, particularly the white mare. And one can track this fascinating connection all over Northern Europe. And this is a very famous hillside in England, called the White Horse of Uffington, which you can only see from above. And on the right, when we went, I led the trip to England with a couple of my students. We had this great job of restoring and tending the chalk. So we were all given a hammer and a piece of chalk to pound into the white chalk to preserve and maintain it. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience, and it indicates this amplification associating the goddess and the archetypal feminine with horses, and particularly in this part of the world, in the UK and Ireland, with white mares. So these are a couple of artifacts that you can see associated with the northern images of Epona, the Roman goddess, with the horses on either side, and here one from Germany, from much later, connecting the archetypal feminine to the white mare. And then very recently, this spectacular picture of the queen with these unbelievable horses on either side of her, which give that sense of a profound dimension of that symbolism in the mythologies connected to the divine feminine, here manifested by the queen. This is a much later painting illustrating the Irish motif of the riders of the Sidhe. And they're all on white mares. And it's a marvelous painting from 1911 with various symbols from the Celtic world, the tree, the cup, and the sword, indicating again that connection to the archetypal feminine in these mythologies of Ireland and Wales and England. Farther down the line, we've got the very famous painting of Fuseli, the nightmare, which connects the white mare to the domain of sleep and death in the most extraordinary ways. And it's based on a poem by a man named Erasmus Darwin, where the nightmare is a kind of impish, sinister elf or fiend associated with the fens and the bogs. And the lady is experiencing a sleep paralysis here, which some of you probably have experienced too. So this connects the white mare to the domain of the feminine, and particularly of dream and death. Just very quickly, I became aware of this material not through my scholarly work. When I was in graduate school, I spent a Christmas with a group of friends at the house of Marina Guinness up on the top of the Topanga Hills. And on Christmas Day, she asked me to go riding with her. And I said, okay. And so we went out on the hills overlooking Santa Monica and the Pacific, and a lovely, innocent friendship. And I went back to my little cubby in Claremont, and I had a dream about Marina. And in the dream, I'm sitting at the base of a tree that I used to love to climb on when I was a kid in the woods behind my house. And to the right of the tree, coming out of the profound darkness of the forest, slowly is Marina riding on a white mare. And she comes slowly towards me from the right with rose petals falling from the air, creating a beautiful matted forest floor, coming directly to the base of the tree, and then looking down at me with a kind of Mona Lisa smile, and then moving off to the left in the dream and disappearing on her white mare in the darkness from which she had come. And a very powerful dream for me. And with this divine feminine, with life emerging from the darkness, this brief flicker of our lives at the base of the tree of life, and then off into the darkness again. Our little life is rounded by a sleep. And so this embraces the opposites that's typically associated with the goddess of life and death in the imagery of Marina on the white horse. So after those encounters with Orgeluz at the top of the hill and the knight wounded lying in the lap, we have the very famous episode of the perilous bed, when Gawain is ferried across the river, taken to this mysterious castle called the Chateau Merveille. It has 400 windows and is under the spell of a wizard named Klingzor, who's of course part of Wagner's territory as well. And we'll find out a lot more about the spell that we probably won't have time to fully cover, but in essence, the castle is inhabited by a large group of knights and ladies who have been led to the castle by Klingsor's magic and held captive and imprisoned there. And they cannot see each other. So there's no relationship possible between men and women in this world. And to illustrate that, again, I've taken this wonderful painting from Edward Burne-Jones from the so-called Briar Rose series, with the sleeping ladies in the castle in that beautiful fairy tale. And so that spell can only be broken when Gawain spends a night on this odd bed that sits on golden wheels with bells hanging from it and slides across a very slippery marble floor and is guarded by a lion. And once Gawain gets onto the bed, he has to endure this assault of spears and swords and crossbows that he's able to endure when he climbs underneath of his shield, which you don't see here. And after that, he will be pounced on by one of these lions and severely mauled right through the shield. And this event is being witnessed by the queens or princesses of the castle. And here, based on Chrétien, you'll see the three queens. And in Wolf von Eschenbach, there are, in fact, four. And the really interesting thing in Chrétien is that the mother and the grandmother have long been dead. So this is the domain of the underworld, presided over by a triple goddess. The third figure is Gawain's sister. And they are anxiously waiting to see if he can break the spell in the castle, which he is able to do. So in Campbell's conversation about this, he introduces this wonderful quote from Goethe, from Faust, relevant to the goddesses and the world of the mothers and the underworld, that you'll see at the top of the screen here. Goddesses are throned here in their loneliness, where there is no space and no time. Speaking of Verlegenheit, and these are the mothers. So the mothers are associated with this domain of timeless space connected to a mysterious other world from which Gawain must redeem the captives. There's a kind of harrowing of hell business here. So what you'll see here are some fairly crude images of the perilous bed and of Gawain being tended by the queens. And here, lying on the body of the lion here, which has mauled him. So the lion is traditionally associated with the archetypal feminine. And I think we have just barely time to focus a few images on this particular motif that I call the feline necrogynotype. But it also has alchemical associations. I mentioned that Wolfram knew a lot about alchemy. So here you'll see the green lion devouring the sun. And Gawain is often seen as a solar hero in the year-long cycle of his adventures. And the devouring of the lion, of course, leads to the radical transformation of the protagonist. Having endured the mysteries of death and rebirth, connected to the great goddesses, whose primary symbol are the lions. So I had great fun, trying to amplify this with images that I knew and did not know. This is a particular fascinating lion that connects to the constellations of the Nemrud stela in the Middle East. And then this is probably the oldest prototypical manifestation of the lion goddess. This is from Çatalhöyük, about 6500 BC. It shows the goddess sitting on a lion throne, giving birth. And she's got her arms gripping the necks of the two lions on either side of her as she endures the profound muscular contractions associated with delivery and birth. And one can track that image connecting the archetypal feminine from Egypt with Sekhmet to the Hellenistic period of Artemis at Ephesus. And then this wonderful, well-known figure, probably of Lilith, standing on the back of lions with the ornithological motifs of the owl on either side of her. And if one wanted to continue to amplify that imagery, I'm sorry, I better go back. There's a wonderful old parabola devoted to the goddess with an interview with Joseph Campbell. And he goes through this fascinating continuity of the big cats associated with the goddesses of the ancient world, coming all the way up to our little black cats with the witches at Halloween. Now, if we had time, we could then proceed with the whole explanation of what's going on in this castle and who was Klingzor, and what is the mystery of the spell that needs to be broken. And all of that gets revealed quite beautifully in the narrative when the three queens explain how Klingzor was wounded when he got in bed with the wife of the king of Sicily and was castrated and sent off to Persida to learn his evil magic and then to return to inflict his spell on the castle. And this is where a very daring and interesting hypothesis, which we can finish with, where Campbell suggests essentially that the king of Sicily at that moment was Frederick II, who's very important to alchemical studies, who was a ward of the powerful Pope Innocent III, with the notion that it was the Pope who had cast a wicked spell upon the population with the dramatic separation of the sexes and the sense of the evil nature of the flesh, hence the nobody being able to see each other. But he doesn't say anything, and Campbell doesn't proceed with Frederick's connection to alchemy from the south of Italy with this wonderful palace in Puglia in the form of an octagon with the oculus here. And this was a palace where the various Hermetic philosophers, astrologers, alchemists, Kabbalistic scholars would find a welcome audience in the courts of Frederick II. And this, of course, led to his excommunication, basically, from the papacy. So that's where we could go at some other point to work more with a focus on the alchemical motifs emerging here in the Grail romances of Parsifal. But I think I better stop here. Just very quickly go through and see where we might have had time to go, but unfortunately do not. So I'm going to stop the share and somewhat belatedly and just ask for any kind of questions or comments or corrections, any responses to this extremely valuable text. Oh, there's Selena Matthews, right, from Pacifica? Yes, nice to see you again. Selena wrote a beautiful dissertation on sound and music. I don't really know anybody else, unfortunately. So I see there's a bunch of entries in the chat. Is Krista still here? Can help me with that?
Yes, I am here.
Thank you.
It's somebody asked if they would be receiving the slides, which I think you already answered, that this is being recorded. That's all I see, unless they're sent to you specifically.
Letitia has her hand up, and you
Go
have to
for it. Go
unmute
ahead.
yourself. The little, yeah, there you
I
go.
was thinking of the lapis, the sacred stone dropped down to the earth by the angels, by the neutral angel, in comparison to the Buddhist belief that there are sacred objects that were left by the Buddhas. I think they're called tankas, for us to find, to transmit
Oh,
to humanity when they're ready to receive it.
uh-huh. Yeah, I don't know much about it, but I have heard that wonderful story.
It felt like a parallel.
And really important aspect of our work with the creative mythology of Joseph Campbell is that when he left Paris after studying the French romances of Chrétien, he wanted to go to Germany in the 20s. And all his French friends said, "Why the hell do you want to go to Germany? Don't do it." But when he got to Munich, what he found was the scholarship had shifted entirely to the Middle East. And they were very involved in Persian, Arabic, Sanskrit sources for motifs in the Grail romances, which radically transformed his understanding of the material, since when he left New York under Roger Sherman Loomis, the whole thing was that this was a, Northern European, Welsh, Irish, Breton. I don't know if Christophe is still here, but the notion of a Breton origins for the Grail stories. But when Campbell got to Munich, the kinds of motifs that you're talking about, connected to the Sanskrit materials, was really quite the focus of the scholarship. And it's a really interesting subject that I could go on about, but
Do you know more about this octagonal temple in Puglia? I was there 2 years ago.
Oh, you were?
On a great tour and never heard anything about that.
Well, Frederick II, the time period in which he emerged was when translations from the Arabic alchemical texts were coming into Europe through Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas around 1200. And a very hospitable patron was provided by Frederick II, not only in Puglia in the south of Italy, but also particular locations in Sicily, since he was the king of Sicily. So that whole aspect of the it's hermetic alchemical architecture, because of the importance of the octagonal symbolism as a geometrical and numerical figure. Apart from that, it's great material to explore more thoroughly, Letitia.
Yeah, our friend Michelle, 3 squares down, was there with me, and we have to go back.
Take me with you. It's a fascinating part of Italy, isn't it?
It is.
Are there other questions or comments?
Yes, I have a question. I was wondering if you could speak about the difference between the octagon and the hexagon symbolism in mythology and dreams.
Well, it's my orientation to the octagon comes from an article in Eranos yearbooks by a man named Victor Zuckerkandl, who wrote a Jungian study called Sound and Symbol. And his article is called The Mystery of the Octave. And it's a beautiful article. So it talks about in Christianity where it's the 8th day, which is the beginning of the new cycle after the 7 days. In a similar way, in the musical composition, where the 8th note is the same octave at a higher level. as an image of repetition and renewal, and therefore frequently appearing in alchemical texts of the period. The hexagon I'm less sure about, and don't know what the associations with the hexagon are. I'm having a feeling of sort of Venus connections, but I'm not sure. And then you've got the pentagon. In other words, you've got a whole network of geometrical symbols to explore, from a mythical point of view, and how they may manifest in dreams and art, particularly artistic, in the traditions of the alchemical texts. So other questions I can't answer are
Thank
always
you.
the most important ones, because they open the field for your own, explorations. Well, this is a Swiss train ride, and it's 12:30, and you know what happens if you don't come to the track at exactly the right time. You might end up in St. Gallen instead of Geneva. So I'm going to observe that great Swiss tradition of punctuality, and I would certainly respond to any further questions or conversations that you can send me through your emails. As my email is provided, esmith@pacifica.edu. I'd love to hear from you. Well, thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rainy day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
See you in person someday.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yeah. Bye-bye.
You'll have to come back and finish all the things that you didn't get a chance to talk about.
Well, that's only another 3 weeks of material that I've got
Yes,
on just on
indeed.
creative mythology.
Seems
It's a
like you'll have to come
fantastic
back when
book.
it's not raining and you can
Well, yes,
drive
that's the
down.
Right.
idea, isn't it? About California.
Maybe
But
part 2 of 3.
Part 2 of 3.
Right.
I'm on it.
Why not?
So particularly thanks to Krista and Marlena, and I don't see
Thank you so
Talia
much.
here, and to
Okay.
Marion, their friend, and we'll see you next time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.